During the 1930s, a small group of ambitious men and women wanted to change the lives of ordinary people radically, to end the chaos and squalor in the cities. These idealists were modernist architects. From small beginnings, they'd fought for their belief that modernism could make people's lives better. And by the time the Second World War had broken out, their gleaming new buildings had begun a process that would change the face of Britain forever.
Hostilities will end officially the 8th of May. The German war is at an end. We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing.
We have won the German war. Let us now win the peace.
Britain emerged from World War II financially ruined, physically exhausted and scarred by battle. A very different country to that which had gone to war.
During those 6 years, central government became all-powerful and swollen, running the economy and the entire country like some kind of huge machine. The 1945 general election gave that power to Labour in a landslide victory. The socialists promised the country a new future, and the people, full of optimism, were only too happy to follow.
Millions were still living in unbearable conditions, and many city areas had been bombed out altogether. There was terrible overcrowding, little or no sanitation, and a desperate need for new homes.
Peace gave the British modern movement an extraordinary opportunity. The nation was desperately searching for ambitious solutions to chronic problems. The modernist time had come.
More than anyone else in Britain, the Soviet émigré architect Bertold Lubetkin had been responsible for changing attitudes towards modernism before the war. His state-of-the-art health centre in Finsbury demonstrated that the modernist vision could be practical, affordable and successful. During the war, the health centre had even been used on a propaganda poster as an image of a Britain worth fighting for.
In Finsbury, the war had made a chronic housing problem much worse, and the council was desperate to renew its relationship with Lubetkin and his architectural practice Tecton.
Built in the heart of the borough, the Spa Green estate was a shining example of new homes for the working classes, and once again it proved both Lubetkin and modernism could deliver. The plans were drawn up during the war, and when the first phase of Spa Green was completed in 1946, tenants queued to move in.
There was a tremendous sense of excitement when Spa Green was completed. Can you describe the atmosphere?
Well, Spa Green was the first estate to be completed after the war in Finsbury, and it was completed by Tecton. And there's only 129 flats, so people coming from the slums wanted to live here. The level of accommodation was much larger. You had amenities that were never provided before. You had a separate loo and bathroom, you had lifts, you had central heating, you had hot water on tap, you had a fully fitted kitchen, pram sheds, bicycle sheds on the ground floor. You had a caretaker who lived here. Everybody had a balcony, which is quite large, I suppose, by post-war standards. And all these little details, which maybe nowadays we take for granted, were very pioneering at the time.
Lubetkin was determined to make life for the residents as convenient as he could. He designed the roof as an aerofoil to push air down into a special area to dry laundry. And astonishingly, the kitchens were even fitted with a waste disposal unit.
Whoops, yeah, well, that's the beauty of it. But,
and then you put this lid on top and it goes...
You put the lid on top and you put water right up to here, and then it's full with water and you empty it all out and it goes into a chamber at the back of the estate and it's emptied twice a week.
And it still works.
There's a love and hate relationship. Some tenants think it's fantastic, some others think it smells, but it's really a personal thing.
Compared to the slums, this estate was heaven. The post-war housing programme was now well and truly underway, and the modernists finally getting many of the commissions. In the next 20 years, over 4 million people would be rehoused.
In 1946, this foundation stone was laid by the Health Minister, Nye Bevan. Although he turned down hundreds of invitations to open other housing developments, he came here to Spa Green because he was so impressed by the modernist innovations and the architecture. He said then, though we are judged now on the amount of houses we build for people, in 10 years' time, we'll be judged on their quality.
It had taken more than 2 decades, but the British modern movement was finally catching up with continental modernism. It wasn't just the host of brand new conveniences that made Spa Green different. Lubetkin built it using huge concrete box frames, the first time they'd been seen in Britain on this scale. At the same time in France, Le Corbusier, the architect who'd inspired many of the British modernists, was employing the same type of construction in Marseille. There, he was building a groundbreaking residential complex, the Unité d'Habitation. The philosophy of modernism was central to the design. There were many social considerations, including a roof garden, shops and amenities. The flats had all mod cons and were filled with light and air.
Actuellement, un seul est presque terminé. Voilà l'appartement.
C'est inouï de voir en plein chantier un appartement déjà prêt.
N'est-ce pas? Voyez-vous, les logis sont inondés de soleil en hiver. Ils sont baignés d'ombre en été. C'est la maison de la fraîcheur en pleine canicule méditerranéenne.
While Le Corbusier was forging ahead, most continental modernists had been stalled by the turmoil the war had caused. Now, for the first time, the British modern movement was about to take the lead. In 1951, Britain's rush to the future was confirmed by the Festival of Britain. The festival was a conscious attempt to lift the population from the long post-war gloom. The government unveiled its plans in 1948, and what followed was 3 years of architectural and design frenzy, overseen by Senior Minister Herbert Morrison.
The festival was a national event, but the centrepiece was a 27-acre site on London's South Bank. Morrison appointed a young architect, Hugh Casson, to commission the buildings, and he took the bold step of hiring only from the new generation of modern architects. Amongst them was Leonard Manazza. His job, to design Bar 51.
We had about a year to get going, and it was a year of kind of frenzy. And there were 2 people who were running it on the site, as it were, and that was Misha Black and Hugh Casson. There were sort of constant meetings to see that you were up to scratch and what you were doing. It was almost unbearably exciting, actually.
Describe the atmosphere in Britain at the time of the Festival of Britain.
There was rationing, and milk rationing and bread rationing and all sorts of rationing, which went on for ages, much longer than it should have done, I think. So it was rather drab. And that's probably the key, or one of the keys to the success of the festival, because everybody enjoyed themselves hugely. I have this vision of men in demob suits sort of solemnly dancing in the rain. That was extraordinary. There was a wonderful feeling of hope.
A modernist extravaganza, the buildings would showcase the movement to 8 million visitors, its biggest audience yet. The site was full of ultra-modern amusements and wonders of engineering. At the time, it was called inspired frivolity. What were the great successes of the festival?
Well, the dome, for a start. It was a remarkable building. It housed rather too many things.
Another of the wonders of the festival was the Skylon. A feat of pure engineering, the crowds were amazed to see this sleek, futuristic shape suspended high above them by nothing more than cables.
The Skylon was brilliant. There's no other word to describe it. If nothing else was kept, that should have been kept. And it's a tragedy that it wasn't. It was a totally brilliant structure.
At the heart of the South Bank was what was to become its only permanent structure, the Royal Festival Hall. With its modern sweeps and curves, it was Britain's first monumental modernist building. Do you think it helped people welcome modern architecture, or at least not reject modern architecture?
Well, welcome it without knowing it, I think. The fact that it was jolly to be and they were happy there, the architecture kind of subconsciously rubbed off on them. So it was accepted without their knowing it.
As the Festival of Britain drew to a close in the autumn of 1951, the general election that October replaced Labour with a new Conservative government. The Conservatives had always been critical of the cost of the festival and were keen to clear the site, but there was no such threat to the housing programme. The desire to build new homes for the working classes was no longer just a socialist dream. It had become a political bandwagon.
This then is our housing message. The quicker you build, the more you will be able to build, and the more you will be asked to build. The fixed socialist figure of 200,000 a year went by the board immediately we took over. Our conservative target is 300,000 a year.
Whilst the architects of Lubetkin's Tecton group had vigorously pursued the Corbusian concept of monolithic housing blocks on estates like Spa Green, one of Lubetkin's protégés was having doubts. Dennis Lasden had been asked to build new homes in the East End of London, and his experiments here would soon produce a landmark in British modernism.
When Dennis Lasden was asked to build housing in Bethnal Green, the first thing he did was come here, walk round the narrow streets and find out how people interacted with each other and what gave this place such a sense of community.
He devised a new type of building, one that he christened a cluster block. He built the first of them in Usk Street.
What was governing Dennis Lasden's thinking at this time?
Well, Dennis Lasden is what you would call a third-generation modern architect. That is to say, he was about 14 years younger than Lubetkin, and Lubetkin was a similar age difference between him and Le Corbusier. By the time Lasden gets to Usk Street here, what we're seeing is a reaction by his generation of modern architect against that somewhat formulaic approach to modern housing.
My generation of architects have been profoundly influenced by the great masters of the modern movement, and they were concerned that people should get sunlight into their homes, that sanitation should work, this, that and the other. Monoliths or not, in terms of architecture, and particularly Corbusier's architecture, the buildings are absolutely memorable, and no change in my view on that. But what it misses is a sense of belonging.
Lasden's cluster block swapped the idea of a single monolithic housing unit for an interlinked group of four. A fifth central tower contained the lifts and services. What he started on a small scale in Usk Street, he perfected on a much bigger scale in the nearby 15-storey Keeling House. The idea was to create a series of busy communal areas and walkways that reminded people of their old terraced streets.
On every second level, Dennis Lasden recreated the East End backyard where children could play safely while their mothers hung out the washing.
Lasden was convinced that these spaces would help the residents of Keeling House forget that they were living in a high-rise block.
Mrs. Jones can call across what is in fact a court on the 15th floor, and she's in some sort of social communion with Mrs. Smith. She's not in a great block where she doesn't know who her neighbour is, living 100 feet down.
Here in Bethnal Green, Lasden's misgivings were an early hint at the coming shift in attitudes towards high-rise life.
Modernist architects thrived in the demand for new housing, but it's easy to confuse the story of British modernism with the history of post-war housing. Yes, many of their commissions were for new homes, but they had wider ambitions for a better world.
The modernists became the architects of the welfare state. At the end of the war, the government's new vision for education demanded more than 2,000 new schools. These buildings, the first step away from home, would shape future generations. The first and most famous modernist school was designed in 1949 and completed 5 years later.
For Alison and Peter Smithson, the wide open spaces of Norfolk are a perfect canvas to design a radically new type of school, a modern crucible for learning for a new age.
The Smithsons rejected the gentle popular modernism of the Festival of Britain's South Bank architecture. Their design for Hunstanton gave British modernism a new twist. They believed in structural honesty, leaving both the materials and the bones of the building exposed. Nothing was hidden.
It's hard to imagine now. The Smithson School was a radical departure from what a British school was meant to look like. Wide spaces, clean lines, a cool and uncluttered appearance signified a change, that education could be easier and more productive if the rigours of modernist design were applied. The Smithsons' idea was that wide spaces, cool, clean, uncluttered lines would be an aid to education, an aid to learning. Has it worked?
I think it has, yes. This building is very open and it's very airy, and it's one of its great attractions, and I think it's something that students, and the staff for that matter, like very much, yeah.
What about the actual fabric of the building? Has it lasted the test of time?
Well, it has its problems. We have some very interesting energy bills, and it is beginning to creak a little, particularly in terms of things like leakages and damp around the building. I believe it was intended as a 40-year project, and its time is up.
Do you like it?
I do, actually, but it's one of those buildings that has to grow on you. And I've been here perhaps 16 years, and I came from a school that was quite an old school and very interesting school, lots of features, and I think at the beginning I found this one rather featureless, but it certainly grows on you.
The Smithsons took a practical approach to the separation of the communal spaces from the learning areas.
We have one stairwell going to just 2 rooms, which is, I think, very unusual in schools. And the students will go to the classrooms and come back down to the main corridors to move around. There are no corridors through the upper classrooms.
And what was the thinking behind that?
I believe it was to make sure that all the available space was used for teaching and to minimise the disruption of the education.
So they would come downstairs and congregate here.
That's right.
And then go to another class.
That's right.
What this building is famous for really is its brutalist architecture. I mean, everything is exposed.
It is.
You see it as it is, but you've softened it.
We have. It used to be painted all in pale blue, which was rather harsh and cold, so we changed it to the primary colours. And I think that has made a difference, and it's made the building more welcoming.
This is a lovely space.
It is, and it's one area of the school that has changed quite a lot. It used to be completely glass, and as you can see now, the lower part there is blackened out with panels.
Why?
Heat retention, mainly.
Just too hot in the summer and also
Very,
too
very
cold
hot
in the
in the
winter.
summer, and difficult to keep it comfortably warm in the winter.
And yet what the Smithsons must have wanted was this kind of the openness to extend to the idea that people could see other people working, they could see education going on right around the school, so that's had to be changed.
It has rather, but practical things get in the way sometimes, don't they?
During the construction of Hunstanton School, the Smithsons had become the leading dissenters in the modern movement. They too had begun to question the modernist orthodoxy of cities full of monolithic high-rise accommodation, but the government charged on regardless. In 1956, there was a new Housing Act.
The government would offer local councils an extra subsidy for every level they built above the 5th. At the very moment the modern movement was questioning building tall, governments were offering local councils cash to do just that.
With the inner city building programmes at full tilt, another post-war housing initiative was gathering momentum. Across Britain, hundreds of thousands of people were moved out of the cities altogether to countryside new towns to create brand new communities.
On a windy hilltop ridge in the heart of Scotland, modernism took a different direction. Here architects had a plan for people's lives, and central to that vision was this, the first multi-layered, multi-purpose town centre in Britain.
This megastructure was a daring idea. Everything the architects believed the people of Cumbernauld would need was put into a single building, and it was topped with this extraordinary piece of engineering, for what else but penthouses for executives. Around the megastructure, the town planners followed the modernist blueprint of zoning. They anticipated the age of the car and built Cumbernauld over and around a network of dual carriageways and link roads. The town has no pavements. Pedestrians are safely separated from traffic on a system of footpaths. The megastructure was unique and became hugely famous. People came from all over the world just to see Cumbernauld, and it won many awards, including one from the American Institute of Architects.
When you first came here to work, 63, 64, what was your overriding emotion about the place?
Excitement. I just wanted to be here. I read about it in the glossy magazines. I had an opportunity to study town planning in what was about to become Strathclyde University. To also be able to live and to work in Cumbernauld was fantastic. It was optimism. We looked out on this and we were able to see this building. It was just about the most thrilling time you could expect to have in your life. You felt you were at the cutting edge.
How did this compare to anything else that was happening in Britain at the time?
Chalk and cheese. It was completely and utterly different from anything that you were likely to find around in the first phase of new towns.
The idea of centralising the services into the megastructure was borrowed from Le Corbusier's Unité d'Habitation. There, in his housing block, he created a high street that ran from one end of the building to the other, right through the middle. Cumbernauld had its own version.
This was a tight-knit town built around a hilltop. Everyone was to be within a reasonable walking distance of the single town centre. Everything was to be in there, from the council offices to restaurants to libraries to shopping and so on.
What was it that drew architects from all over the world?
I think the sense that something was happening here which was mold-breaking.
From the penthouse, you really do get the sense that Cumbernauld has landed in the middle of the countryside.
You do, yes. People coming in from Glasgow hadn't seen the lights of this. They had their own front door, a bit of a garden back in front, place for a car, and most of them bought cars there because the factories were here then and the employment was good. To attract industry here, you've got to provide housing for the workers for a start, which was done at Glasgow Overspill, but also for executives from the factories. The owners and the higher executives had to have housing in the area to bring them here, or else they wouldn't have come.
But despite the award-winning visionary design, something went very wrong at Cumbernauld. The population target of 90,000 was never realised, and the 55,000 who did come weren't a lucrative enough market to bring the big-name shops to the megastructure. Or perhaps people didn't like the thinly disguised social engineering. The population used their new cars to desert the town centre for the shops in the big cities like Glasgow, just 13 miles down the brand new A80.
When you look at it now, what do you feel?
I think it is so sad that here you have the lives and ambitions and hopes of so many, many people, not just professionals, people who lived here, people who still live here. It will never be that megastructure, it will never be Corbusian, hey, look at it, here you've got, penthouses riding over a town centre. These were the first people who said, look, town centres shouldn't empty at night, they should have people in them. People should be able to come down from their houses, go to the restaurants and everything. Of course, now we have shopping centres and they lock them up at night to stop people doing nasty and unpleasant things in them.
It was a hard building, certainly. Been made softer now, more like the present day shopping centres. However, we've lived here since 1960, brought up a family, 4. They're all living here. We've now got 9 grandchildren, so they must like it somewhere or other, and the town air must be good.
By 1965, new homes were being built at a rate of 1,000 a day. In the 20 years since the war, millions had been rehoused, and as far as most people were concerned, the social housing programme was a success.
After losing faith in high-rise schemes, some modernists had been experimenting. Sheffield's Park Hill estate was a medium-rise alternative. It used long, snake-like buildings, an idea that coined the expression streets in the sky.
It's like being in heaven up here, because we've always been poor people And we've had so many good friends up here. And these places is just lovely for us, either for old age or young age.
After a decade of government cash incentives, local councils had dramatically altered the landscape. But thousands of tower blocks have been thrown up across the country, built with no facilities and little regard for the needs of the people who were to live there. The local authorities and the building industry had taken over. This was not the landscape the modernists had set out to create. It was modern, but it was not modernist. In 1968, the Essex borough of Newham had over 110 tower blocks, including 9 on a new estate in Canning Town. One of those blocks, Ronan Point, was to be the scene of a tragedy that would bring the housing programme to a crashing halt. Following an explosion in a flat near the top of the block, one corner of the building collapsed, killing 5 and injuring 17. The tower had been built using a system build, prefabricated from concrete panels that slotted together. Systems like these had become commonplace to help meet the demands and pace of the housing programme.
Exactly where was it in this area?
Well, it was here. There was an electricity substation in the bottom of Ronan Point, which it was impossible to move because, you either got to build a new one or the simplest thing was to build this round it. So what's in there is the only thing that remains. There were all these factories turning all over the country, turning out concrete panels, and the architects were part of this, and the engineers, and in a way, the architects were a bit like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Somebody had set in motion something, and nobody knew how to stop it, and then suddenly, one morning, this lady gets up, make a cup of tea, bang, quarter of the side of the building falls down, and everybody starts saying, why?
Sam Webb was a local authority architect in London when the explosion happened, but he led the campaign to have Ronan Point investigated and torn down.
I knew that the floors were joined onto the walls with these little bits of hardboard. That's the only other bit of Ronan Point that is left. I mean, this prevented, if you can imagine, that was stuck on the bottom of the floor slab, and that prevented the floor slab sliding out. So when the gas explosion came, that was all that was stopping the building falling apart. You were building a 24-storey building, and that was what was holding it. That was the real strength of the building, and it's a crazy system. If it had been a conventional building, reinforced concrete frame, it would never have fallen down. There's no way that that small explosion would have done that.
Do you think people still associate Ronan Point in some way with modernism?
I think some do. I think it's mistaken. I suppose to say Ronan Point was the modern movement, it's a bit like trying to blame Mozart for Muzak. I mean, you hear this stuff when you go up and down in lifts, and you can't say that Beethoven and Mozart are responsible for that, although it is music of a kind.
At the time, the British modernists might not have guessed it, but the tragic disaster at Ronan Point would prove to be the beginning of the end.